couple of years ago, there was this potential interest that there was maybe a bit of a magic bullet that by extending your fasting window, you were inevitably going to rely more on, for example, using up stored body fat for energy and maybe losing more weight.
While shift workers don't necessarily have that choice about when they can eat and optimal timing strategies, a lot of people will follow some sort of intermittent fasting or time restricted eating pattern. What does our understanding of chrononutrition, how does that relate to people who might be following a 16-8 or another
Mm.
intermittent fasting schedule where they are going through large portions of the waking day, specifically morning and lunchtime, without taking any calories?
Yeah, so there's an interesting distinction because there are often terms intermittent fasting and time restricted eating or time restricted feeding are often used interchangeably, but there is certainly a distinction in what we would refer to them as in the research. So intermittent fasting would simply refer to any sort of extended period with no energy intake whatsoever, but with no discernible pattern to that. Whereas time restricted eating has the characteristic of being the same pattern of feeding and fasting as a window repeated from day to day. So, for example, some of the intermittent fasting regimes might have something like alternate day fasting or something like a 5-2, where people eat normally 5 days a week and then either don't eat at all or maybe have only around 500 calories on 2 days of the week. And they might select different days each week, to do that. There may not necessarily be much of a pattern to it. And then time restricted eating would involve, like you say, a 16-8 is a really popular example of this, where people will consume all of their energy for that day within an 8-hour window and they won't eat for the other 16. And the most common approach to this has actually been to do this from the middle of the day onwards. So people might say have their first meal at midday and they may have dinner around 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. So overall, their total eating window is about 8 hours. We've also then had the emergence of, in research, this early time restricted eating, which is the exact same principle, only the period of eating is from, say, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. or something like that. From a circadian perspective, the early part of the day is slightly more aligned with the kind of optimal, like I said, kind of our ability to have optimal glucose tolerance and otherwise. And there may be a slight advantage to that for some of those outcomes in research when we compare, say, an early window to a kind of middle of the day window. In otherwise healthy people, I'm not convinced that those differences actually matter from a real world or kind of clinical perspective, so to speak. And the ultimate, I guess, a couple of years ago, there was this potential interest that there was maybe a bit of a magic bullet that by extending your fasting window, you were inevitably going to rely more on, for example, using up stored body fat for energy and maybe losing more weight. Again, we do know that there's really no difference at all once you match total energy intake. Whether someone eats within 4 hours or 6 hours or 8 hours or 12 hours isn't going to make a difference to weight loss or gain. So I think for people that, deliberately follow one of those patterns and maybe prefer the middle of the day type of window, I don't see any difficulty with that. But I do think that some of those, for a long-term perspective, some of those other factors still apply, and that it would be better to have their kind of biggest meal of the day as one of their first meals, for example, rather than following an 8-hour window and maybe eating between, say, midday 8 or particularly, because I know I've spoken to people who do, 2 p.m. till 10 p.m. and have their biggest meal at 10 p.m. And they're typically actually monitoring things like their total energy intake. So they're saying, well, I'm fine. It's like, yes, because you're conscious and monitoring your energy intake. But over time, again, that will be something that, based on everything we know, we would expect to potentially add up over time to, compared to someone that followed their or consume their biggest meal earlier in the day, we would expect that potentially then to result in, say, for example, better glycemic control, better glucose tolerance. So I still think some of some of those characteristics of your distribution of energy still might apply in the context of an 8-hour window where people choose it to be in the middle of the day.